My name's Cormac Kinsella. I'm one of the programmers of the... Just speak a little louder? Okay, and slower. I'll start again. You're very welcome to the Dublin Festival of History this afternoon. My name's Cormac Kinsella, one of the programmers of the festival. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event, Sister Against Sister, Women and the Irish Civil War. Today's event will be signed by Cormac and Vanessa, and we have 4 historians to discuss the Civil War and Irish women. So we have leading historians of Irish women's history who will reflect on events leading to civil war and the contribution made by women to the war from both sides of the divide. Gender-based violence, trauma and the legacy of war are new areas of study enhanced by archival evidence and writings of former activists. So on the panel today we have from DCU Dr. Leeann. And Leeann is a lecturer in the School of History and Geography in Dublin City University. She's the author of Irish Writer. She's the author of Irish Writer and Political Activist's biography, Rosamund Jacob, and most recently biography of the playwright, novelist and historian Dorothy Mcardle. Then there's Dr. Mary MacAuliffe from UCD, and she's a historian, lecturer and director of gender studies at UCD. She specialises in Irish women's and gender history, histories of gendered and sexual violence of Ireland's revolutionary period and histories of sexualities. And her most recent book is a biography of Margaret Frances Skinner, who was a Scottish-born revolutionary and feminist. She fought during the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin as a sniper, among other roles, and was the only female wounded in the action. Dr. Margaret Ward, who we have to give special thanks to for bringing the event to us today. This event was entirely her idea, and she deserves special thanks for bringing it to us, and we're really thrilled to have her and her panel here. And she's the author of Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, Suffragette and Sinn Féiner, which has been widely acclaimed, and her other books include Unmanageable Revolutionaries, Women and Irish Nationalism, and a biography of Maud Gonne. She is currently Honorary Senior Lecturer in History with the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's University of Belfast. And our moderator this evening, we're very lucky to have Fionnuala Walsh from UCD. She is Assistant Professor in Modern Irish History, and her book, Irish Women and the Great War, was published by Cambridge University Press in July 2020. Could you please welcome our panel? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cormac. Before we start, I just want, on behalf of the panel, first of all, to give the apologies of Shifra Aiken, who was also supposed to be with us today. And you probably know her book, Spiritual Wounds, and it's been getting a lot of publicity. It's a fantastic book. So Shifra's in huge demand at the moment, and it turned out that our loss is Galway's gain tonight. And she says how sorry she was that she couldn't be with us as well. Before I turn over to Fionnuala, who I'm so pleased that has come to moderate for us, I just wanted to say a few things about the fact that throughout this decade of centenaries, not only us as historians, but a lot of other historians have worked really hard to make sure that women have been included, and we have been very successful in many areas, like in 2016, the buses that went round, you know, the kinds of publicity that was given to the fact that women took part. But for the Civil War, I think it's much more difficult, and it's so often the war of brother against brother. And what we've been trying to do in talking about the fact that it was also sister against sister is to look at those complexities. So, and it's not really being given enough official recognition. So again, you know, we resort to self-help and self-activity. So in February, Mary got funding from UCD to have an online discussion to mark Cumann split, because Cumann was the first organisation to reject the treaty. The History Hedge School had an event in Glasnevin on Sister Against Sister, and then we felt with the Dublin Festival of History, we're so pleased that they were so enthusiastic when we put this suggestion to them, so I wanted to thank them for that. And we've all been on panels together over the period of time, but I just wanted to give a particular thanks to Fionnuala for so readily agreeing to be the moderator today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Margaret. I think we might start with the Anglo-Irish Treaty and with the debates over that, and of course, which women played such a pivotal role. So I might start with you, Leeann, if you want to maybe take us from there and maybe talk a little bit about Mary MacSwiney.
Yeah, so there were 6 female deputies in the second Dáil, and those 6 women were all vehemently anti-treaty, leading to a lot of criticism, a suggestion that they were in some way hysterical, that they were in some way viragos, even though you had clearly men who were as anti-treaty, but the gender roles of the time came into play, so women weren't supposed to be in the political sphere, let alone, speaking about bloodshed and the necessity to establish the Republic and maintain the Republic. The 6 female deputies were Ada English, Kate O'Callaghan, Kathleen Clark, Countess Markovic, Mrs. Pearce, and Mary MacSwiney. And it's important to note that not all of those women talked about dead male relatives. Ada English, in fact, made it very clear that she was rejecting the treaty on the basis of the fact that she felt that it did not establish the republic that was declared in name in 1916 and that was fought for during the War of Independence. And she made the point that she was not speaking on behalf of any dead male relative. Mary MacSwiney, of course, is probably best known in the context of the treaty debates. Mary MacSwiney's brother, Terence, died in a very well-publicised hunger strike in Brixton Jail in October 1920. And I think it's important to kind of remember what Mary MacSwiney witnessed. She literally watched as her brother went from a relatively healthy man in his early 40s to become, as one IRA man said when watching his coffin in the City Hall in Cork, he said how he looked like, his corpse looked like a child of 12, and she literally watched him starve to death for the Republic. And she stood up and spoke for 2 hours and 35 minutes, longer than the 5 plenipotentiaries in total. And her speech drew a lot of sneering in the Dáil. Arthur Griffith sneered at her. She responded by saying, "I care not if I take more of your time than you are willing to give." And she said that she had every right to speak on behalf of what she went, on the basis of what she went through in Brixton Jail. Now, she was somebody who became very much a cipher for extreme republicanism in years afterwards, but her speech actually was a mixture of, yes, extreme republicanism. She talked about if the men die, the women will take their place. If the women die, the children will take their place, and the next generation will take their place in fighting for a republic. But at the same time, she did make a statement on the basis of, or statements on the basis of principle. She said that Michael Collins was wrong to suggest that you could accept the treaty and then, not take the oath, that first of all, Lord George would never agree to that. And she said that, that was not what a Republican would do. A Republican had to tell the truth and be noble, etc. And she was, as I said, sneered at hugely. At this point, there's no sister against sister in the Dáil, so the 6 female deputies are all, as I said, anti-treaty, leading arguably Arthur Griffith to refuse to enfranchise women over the age of 21 until the public vote on the treaty was taken, for fear that all women were reflected by the 6 women in the Dáil.
Thanks very much for that, Leeann. And actually, thinking about the enfranchisement of women, 1922 being, of course, such an important year for women's suffrage. Margaret, you maybe want to come in on that?
Yeah, the whole, the franchise issue was a really important issue, not simply for Republican women. Women between the ages of 21 and 30 weren't going to be able to vote on the treaty because the vote had only been given to women over 30 in 1918. So there was a women's delegation to the Dáil, and that included the Irish Women's Franchise League, the militant suffrage organisation, the Women's International League for Peace, which had been the organisation set up during the First World War, the Irish Women Workers' Union, and Cumann. So you can see that women came together from feminist, Labour and Republican areas to come together to argue that women had the right to the vote. And what they distributed leaflets saying, "Justice for Irish women demand the vote on the same terms as men." And Arthur Griffith's attitude was, as Leeann has said, he wasn't going to allow any women's organisations come in there with designs to torpedo the treaty, is how he put it. Hannah She Skeffington writes to an American friend and says that it was, just like suffrage times again, it absorbed all her energies. Women were really active, trying to argue with individual deputies to support women. So on the 2nd of March, Deputy Kate O'Callaghan introduces a motion for equal franchise in the Dáil. And it's a time when Constance Markievicz speaks very movingly about the fact that the suffrage issue, when she was a very young woman with her sisters in Sligo, this was her first taste, or her first bite at the apple of freedom, as she put it. Kate O'Callaghan, very methodically, she went through and she said, I was a suffragist 10 years ago. In fact, Hannah She Skeffington had taught her. I mean, there was great links between the suffragists and nationalist women. And she methodically went through all the arguments Griffith had put up. He said, it would take 8 months to revise the electoral register. Britain wouldn't allow them to change it, etc., etc. And she argued very strongly that these were not reasons for not giving women who had taken the brunt of the war during the War of Independence and denying them any say on the future. But the motion was lost basically on very similar grounds to the treaty vote itself. But within it, there's even more bitterness, I think, during the debate on the franchise. Joe McGrath, who has taken over from Constance Markievicz as Minister for Labour, sneers at the women in men's clothing and things like that. So there's a very kind of bitterly gendered references in the Dáil during the franchise debates.
Thanks very much for that. And speaking of bitterness and divides, I think we might move on to divide within Cumann and when it begins to be sister against sister. Mary, do you want to maybe bring us in on that?
Yes. After the treaty debates, of course, the treaty has to be then decided on by the different organisations who had participated in the fight for Irish freedom. And one of the first to meet, in fact, the first to meet, is Cumann. The executive had already stated its position, which was anti-treaty, and then they call a meeting for the 5th of February in the Mansion House in Dublin, and they call as many branches to get to Dublin as they can, and they come from all over the country, from Northern Ireland, from the West, and actually only in the Republican strongholds of Cork and Kerry do they not get there, because there's a train strike, and so they can't actually get to Dublin. But overall, there's over 600-700 women at the Mansion House at this period, and they have a very long and protracted debate that day. And in fact, the National Library of Ireland have made the transcripts of that debate available, and you can go on and read them. You can't download them, but you can read them online on that site. And it makes for a very interesting reading in the reasons why the women were anti-treaty for the most part. But also there is a cohort who are pro-treaty. And some of those were the founders of Cumann, like Jenny Wise-Power, who is an amazing woman, had been active in politics since the Ladies' Land League. When she was a teenager, she knew Anna Parnell. She considered herself a Parnellite all of her life. She'd been involved in nationalist, cultural nationalism and suffrage activism. She was a politician, and she and her daughter, Nancy, were very much engaged in Cumann. And they are pro-treaty. They believe in the stepping stone argument that Collins had put forward. So there is a debate between the women. And I think this shows that these women aren't just there as handmaidens of the IRA or the Republicans. These are women who are deeply committed, who are moved by ideologies, who can make up their own minds on what positions they're going to take. And for the most of them, the oath of allegiance is a problem. The woman, as mentioned, that I wrote a biography on, Margaret Skinnider, born in Scotland, in Coatbridge outside of Glasgow, but of Irish descent, but an Irish nationalist, fought in 1916. It has spent the War of Independence as part of Fairview Cumann, did all the things Cumann women did, minding arms dumps, intelligence work, fundraising, running a safe house, all of that sort of thing, makes a speech about the oath of allegiance. And she said, no Irish man who would take the oath of allegiance could then consider himself an Irish man, because they have taken an oath already. That oath to the proclamation, to the Republic declared in 1916. And the 1916 proclamation, with its promise of equality for women, of full and equal suffrage, which of course is why they're, they really want that equality of suffrage in the treaty debate, and indeed it is promised to be included in the 1922 Constitution, but of course that'll come too late for the election in June of 1922. They believe in that republic, and they're not going to betray it. They have been through too much at this stage. They have suffered and endured the raids and the reprisals, the physical and gendered violence against them during the War of Independence. Some of them suffered hair cropping. People like Kathleen Clark, whose husband had been shot, executed in 1916, Tom Clark, had endured raid after raid in her house. Her sisters in Limerick, one of them had had her hair cropped by the Black and Tans, and her hand slashed and nearly bled to death during one of those raids. So they had suffered, not just like Mary MacSwiney seeing a brother die, but that persistent and consistent violence against them for almost 2 years. And they were not going to accept this compromised treaty. They also discussed the border, and this was an issue. Even though it was a reality way before, obviously. They discussed it in February. But the Northern women bring that in, and what is going to happen about this. And they saw the treaty was offering none of the things that they had fought for, and they absolutely rejected it. It was over 600 of the women voted against the treaty. The women who voted for the treaty leave the meeting then. While they are heckled by some of them, a lot of women are very sad to see them go. They feel like they're losing good women who had participated, who had given great work to Cumann. And then a month later, they hold a meeting, also in the Mansion House, also well attended, and set up an organisation called Cumann na Saoirse, which is a pro-treaty organisation. Now, it never becomes as big as Cumann, but it is quite active during the Civil War period, and it only lasts until December 1923. But it is a very important vehicle for the politics of the pro-treaty women, and through that, they support the pro-treaty candidates in the election and throw their energies behind that. And then in the Civil War, this is where the real bitterness comes in. They function as intelligence gatherers for the National Army. They also are part of working as wardresses, I suppose, in the Mountjoy in Kilmainham. When the Cumann are in jail, there's over 600 women imprisoned there during the Civil War. And they get a very nasty term. They're called Cumann na Searchers by the Cumann women. So you can see that real bitterness. One example I'll give you is two women. One woman, Kathleen Brown, whom I wrote a biography of several years ago, goes on to become a senator in the Irish Free State. She's vehemently pro-treaty, absolutely. Now, she's a bit always dogmatic in her politics. Her best friend, Nell Ryan, one of the famous Ryan sisters of Tom Coole, Nell's sister would be Min Ryan, who married Richard Mulcahy. Another two sisters married Sean T. O'Kelly. Obviously, one died and then the other married him. They fell out over the treaty, and they threatened to have the National Army or the IRA burn each other out during that period, and they never speak again. And so you can see that bitterness is there between the women. So that split in the women is as bitter as the split between the brother against brother in this period.
Thanks for that. I think it's really one of the features of recent research on this and work by yourself and by Leeann. has really helped to show this idealism that's at stake there. And just, often this idea of the women who are anti-treaty, that it's very much them as representatives of the dead, or seen as hysterical, seen as furies. And actually, when you get into it, so much is based on their own experiences, their own political ideologies. And for a long time, they're in a sense denied that agency in the historical record. And I think it's worth noting, Mary mentioned that the Cumann, the transcripts of their debates are available to view. And the treaty debates are all actually available to read online. And they're a really fantastic resource. One can get lost for hours and hours in them, but they really are well worth looking at. Just then moving on to thinking about the Civil War itself and what women actually did during that. Margaret, do you maybe want to talk to us a little bit about the Battle for Dublin and women's role in that period?
Yes, women's role is really quite different from previously. Before that, Cumann was very much the auxiliary organisation to the men, whereas now, I mean, there's so, in terms of the men who are fighting against the treaty, there are so many fewer of them. They really need the women's support, and women have this military support role, which I'll explain. So it's much more active, it's much more working in conjunction with the men. And in 1916, women had to go to the outposts and kind of beg to be let in. This time, women were absolutely essential. Men would practically drag them in for their help. So the lead up to the Civil War in Dublin is that the forecourts gets occupied by the anti-treaty forces in April, and they stay there kind of very defiantly. And there's all the discussion between the provisional government and the British government as to what is to be done with them. And so somebody like Leeann Mellows, for example, who has both an IRA role and he's a Dáil TD, he walks to the Dáil during the day and he goes back to the forecourts at night. But it is, a symbol of resistance. So eventually the British loan heavy artillery for the provisional government to fire on the forecourts. So this happens on the 20th of June. And we now have a lot more evidence and testimony from women as to what happened when they heard the shells. Now, they were out. This is the forecourts in the middle of Dublin. And, for example, Maura Comerford is out in Clonsky, staying in Maud Gonne's house. She and her mother are there, and they've got a lot of refugees from Belfast, and they're helping them and supporting them. And Maura says that she hears the shelling and she gets on her bike and rushes to the forecourts. They've also set up the IRA headquarters on the hotels, the Gresham and other hotels, all along the east side of O'Connell Street. And Dermot Ferreter has said it was so badly planned that, in fact, Maura Comerford really was the messenger between the forecourts and Oscar Traynor, who was the Dublin IRA commander. He was in the Hammond Hotel. And she, in her memoirs are fantastic. I really recommend that you read them. They were published a few months ago, and they really just give you such a sense of what it was like. So in the forecourts, there was just Maura Comerford, Madge Clifford, and Bridie Klein, three women. Bridie, she talks about boiling porridge oats with water, I think it was the only thing, and doling it out in mugs to the men, and the women trying to sleep through the shelling. Madge Clifford was acting as a secretary during this time, and the women also learn how to drive the big military lorries and the ambulance. Mm-hmm. Oscar Traynor shows them how to change gears, and they just practice up and down, and then they're off delivering supplies through the streets that are really, very, very dangerous to go through, and Maura sometimes on her bike and sometimes driving a military lorry. And she gives very vivid portraits of when she goes to one of the hotels, and she says all the guests' towels are in this great big pyramid in the middle of the hall, and the priest is saying confession to the men behind it, and there's this steady stream of men going up the spiral staircase with sandbags and things like that. So there are only 70 men and 30 women altogether, really, in the Battle of Dublin. There are not many. So the forecourts falls within 3 days, and there's about 200 arrested. Moore is given a Red Cross armband so that she could escape, to look like she was a civilian, and she says no, that's under false pretenses, and she rips it off, but then she just gets on her bike and slips away and reports for duty. But there were other women, so she says she goes to Moran's hotel and sees Constance Markievicz acting as a sniper on top of it, and Maura says that she felt that a bit repellent. I think it's the first time she's kind of sees it up close, and she says Markievicz just sort of makes her go to one side, and Markievicz is continuing. So some women, and Margaret Skinner, I think nobody stops them taking up a military role if they want to. Now, I think that's one of the differences between 1916 and then. But other women like Margaret Skinner, Nora Connolly, Ina Connolly, the daughters of James Connolly, they hear the sounds as well, and they rush in and they form a first aid post in Tara Hall on Talbot Street, and a lot of the Cumann women are working there in first aid, and then the others are in the hotels. And finally, the last outpost is the Hammond Hotel, and you've got Linda Cairns, who had had a big jail sentence during the War of Independence, but had escaped from jail with Ethna Coyle and others. There's Muriel McSweeney, the widow of Terence McSweeney, and they're there in the Hammond Hotel with Cathal Brewer at the final outpost, and they refuse to leave. Again, they're quoting the Proclamation and equal rights, and Cathal Brewer refuses to surrender, and he rushes out firing, and he is fatally wounded. He doesn't die then, and Linda Cairns, who's a trained nurse, holds his artery and in the ambulance as they go away. So women are there up until the very end. And then the battle, and Mary's going to talk about the countryside, but there are other women who are very prominent in the Cumann executive, like Bridget O'Mullane. She comes from Sligo, and she drives along, and she volunteers for duty. But what she becomes after so many men are imprisoned is she becomes the director of propaganda in Dublin, and she edits War News, the IRA publication. And she, in her pension statement, because she's trying to get a pension for her war service, she talks about how very dangerous it was. I mean, she and Sheila Humphreys and other Cumann women would also organise painting squads where they would go out and paint slogans like "Be true to the Republic," call off the Free State death squads and that kind of thing. But they said that they would be fired on. There would be Free State sentries near Trinity firing at them and just above their heads. And she said it was really very, very dangerous. They also would collect information on deaths and injuries and arrests, because they would have to give that to the IRA for inquest and things like that. And in fact, it's interesting, when she does apply for a pension, she's arguing that it shouldn't be a Cumann activist. She was seconded to the IRA at this time, and she should have been treated the same as the men but she wasn't. She was treated as Cumann. But some of the women do take on roles that are way above anything that women have done before, and she is arrested and is in jail for the rest of the Civil War, and one of the last people to be released.
Thanks Thanks very much for that. And I think, it's interesting just so much focus on what women could do during the Easter Rising and where women were allowed in and where they were denied access to. And then, the sheer necessity seems to just, allow them to have more opportunities perhaps at this stage to take on different roles.
It's interesting to look at Maura Comerford's pension application as well, because, the women all had to get men to testify that what the women said was true. I mean, you couldn't just take their word for it. And it had to be that the men had to prove that they were militarily active in order to qualify for the pension. Oscar Traynor says of Maura Comerford that she was inspirational and that we just don't know how she managed to deliver the messages in these bullet-strewn streets.
Yeah, and that's very, very important, I think, history to uncover in that sense. So moving beyond Dublin then into the country, I know there are parts of Ireland where the Civil War was very active, Kerry being one example, and I know there are areas where Cumann also played a really significant role. So Mary, do you want to maybe talk us through some of that?
Oh yeah, once Dublin falls, obviously the fighting moves out into the country and really down into the Munster Republic, and there's a kind of a line drawn across from Waterford to Kerry. Now that line shifts back very quickly until it's really just West Cork and Kerry. But the women are still playing that very active role, and as Margaret said, they have much more senior roles to play than they had done during the War of Independence. For example, Austin Stack appoints Margaret Skinner Quartermaster General of the IRA once he's arrested, and until she is arrested, she operates in that role. And that means she's controlling all of the monies for the entire country that the anti-treaty IRA have to get arms and ammunition and support themselves. And when she is arrested, as she is in December 22, that role is then taken over by her best friend, Nora Connolly, who does that until she is arrested. So the women are actually doing way more than they had done. And of course, Ethna Coyle was holding up trains in Donegal with guns and things like that. And somebody like Nora O'Keefe, Margaret Skinner's partner, goes back to Tipperary, where she's from, and for a number of weeks until she is arrested, she runs an anti-treaty, or sets up and prints and publishes and disseminates an anti-treaty newsletter for the IRA there in Tipperary. But once we get back to Kerry and the landing at Fionnuala on August the 2nd, 1922, you begin to see what happens when the National Army takes over an area and what happens to the militant women there. I've been reading recently the letters of Hannah O'Connor, who talks about that first day that the National Army and with the Dublin Guard under Paddy O'Daly arrive in Fionnuala and then march on Tralee. And she talks about, we were ready, we had been preparing for this. They knew this was coming. They were prepared again to go out and fight, so they had been making first aid equipment, bandages, knapsacks, getting ready to provide that support. And they do that initially, that initial support, which was very typical of what the Cumann did in the War of Independence. But as the National Army take over the towns and villages and the IRA have control of the countryside, they then become the dispatch carriers. They are protecting the arms dumps. They're moving arms and ammunition around. They are the propagandists, and propaganda work is so important. Again, the women in Tralee are pasting up the propaganda news sheet, Humphrey Murphy's The Invincibles. That was the news sheet that was being printed there. They're pasting that up on the walls, and they're getting arrested and held in Tralee jail. And on, I think it's September the 9th, 10 of them are arrested in Tralee. And they are taken, eventually they take a whole pile of them by cattle boat from Blennerville around the coast, because of course the train service was quite insecure then, and sail them up to Dublin. And they have a terrible time on the cattle boat, and they have a terrible time in Tralee jail, and they're treated very badly. But you also see the violence that is used by the National Army against the women that they see operating as anti-treatyites, irregulars. They see them as crazy women. The reports from the Kerry Command are full of invective about these women. I think they fear them most or hate them more than they hate the men. At least the men are fighting a battle against each other, and they understand that in terms of masculinity, I suppose, normative masculinity. But the women, they just can't get their heads around it all. And on the 9th of September in Killarney, 6 Cumann women are dragged out of their beds, stripped naked and painted green. And that's what the reports in the newspapers say. But I found a report by one of the women who was dragged out of her bed, and the language suggests that something more happened on that night to the 6 women. She said her nerves were gone after that. I suffered serious indignity and assault from the Free State, from the staters, as they were called. And in looking at how gendered and sexualized violence is written up by these women in their memoirs, they often use those terms: insult, indignity, assault, their nerves were gone. So it is more than just painting their bodies green that is happening here. And again, you can see that, for example, in the terror months in Kerry are March and April, where you have Knocknagoshel, Ballyseedy, Countess Bridge, Cahersiveen, and then Clashmelkin, where in Knocknagoshel a trap mine is set for National Army soldiers, and several of them are blown up, killed. And then the response by the National Army is furious and ferocious. You have the 9 prisoners tied around a mine in Ballyseedy, again in Countess Bridge, and again elsewhere, and then the siege of Clashmelkin Cage. So the response to 5 National Army men being killed in Knocknagoshel, you end up between 19 plus Republicans being killed either by being tied to mines or being executed. So the response is horrendous. But what we don't see in those terror months is what's happening to women. For example, in Knocknagoshel, a young woman who was the member of the local Cumann branch wrote the letter that was delivered to Castle Island Post, where the National Army were stationed in Harnet's Hotel, to get them to come out to Knocknagoshel to go to the trap mine. So she is setting the trap. And they figured this out, and in the reprisals post Knocknagoshel, she and 3 of her sisters, and the sentence is, have their hair cropped under torture. So basically they are taken in, they're interrogated, they're tortured, and their hair is cropped off. And that sounds very prosaic, but it was very violent. And then later on, an awful lot of the women who had to pick up the bodies at Ballyseedy, a couple of them basically lose their minds after that. One very poignant application to the military pension files is from a young woman called Molly O'Shea, whose brother George was one of the victims at Ballyseedy. And in picking up his body, she was never the same again. And it is her other brother who's making an application for the pension. And she said, he said that she had spent many years in Killarney Asylum and now was at home with him, and he was her carer. And he had, it was very difficult to get her a pension. She'd been a member of Cumann, had been anti-treaty, had served the local IRA in dispatch carrying and intelligence gathering, and now it was impossible to get care for her in her older age, but also in her disability due to PTSD, basically, to trauma. And as this continued, eventually the call to dump arms comes after Liam Lynch is killed. But you see in Kerry, the women, and the Kerry command say it, they say everywhere is quiet except the women. And the women are still going on about the Republic. And when W.T. Cosgrave comes to a meeting before the election in late 1923, there is a huge march of Cumann through Tralee in opposition to him, carrying coffins and opposing this state that they will never accept. So in many ways, the women become firmly committed to the Republican cause. And you can see then how they get, how the Free State politicians and the Free State Army begin to construct them as furies, as Amazons, as unmanageable, ungovernable revolutionaries. P.S. O'Hegarty, in his 1924 history, the victory of Sinn Féin, is hateful about them, vitriolic, as is Cosgrave. And it is because the women were fully committed to the cause and did all the things that they did do despite the violence used. And this was the women who weren't arrested. The violence in the prisons then was excessive as well.
I think it's interesting, you know, women are taking on these additional roles, and then they're getting this increased condemnation, not just, as activists on the other side, but also because they're transgressing gender norms, right? They're engaging in behaviour that's going beyond the bounds of their sex and is seen as unwomanly, unfeminine, and so there's this extra level of vitriol. But also they're not immune from their gender doesn't prevent them from being assaulted or suffering any of those ill effects. You mentioned imprisonment there at the end, so I might bring in Leeann now to talk about the women who were imprisoned and the hunger strikes that happened there.
As Mary said, there was a perception that there was a woman problem. I think one politician talked about a woman problem in the context of the Civil War. And of course, so over 600 women were incarcerated across Ireland. The three main sites of incarceration in Dublin were Mountjoy, then after from February 1923, Kilmainham as well as Mountjoy, and then in late April, early May, North Dublin Union. But women were also incarcerated in other jails across Ireland, and sometimes then brought from those local jails to Dublin. You also had women arrested in England who were deported over to Ireland. The Free State politicians, the provisional government politicians, later Free State politicians, of course, had worked with those women during the War of Independence, that knew how invaluable their work had been to the revolutionary campaigns, and knew their potential then to destabilise the state that they were trying to establish. So hence, this large number of women incarcerated during the Civil War, much more than had been during the War of Independence. The conditions in the jails were absolutely horrendous, very heavy overcrowding, leading to some of the more militant women like Bridie O'Mullane, who Margaret talked about there earlier, actually engaging in conflict with the prison authorities, throwing furniture out of the cells, refusing to enter back into the cells at the point when lockup would happen each night. There was free association in the jails during the day, and then there was a certain time when the women were put back into the cells. There's a lot of violence in the jails. There's a lot of fear of violence, so there's kind of low-grade violence all the time erupting into kind of heavy violence at certain points, particularly, I suppose, during the removal of women from Kilmainham to the North Dublin Union in the end of April, early May. There's even a suggestion of sexual violence. There's that kind of fear of the soldiers' gaze as well. So there's a sense that some of the warders are actually drinking very heavily, and that the kind of low-grade violence could erupt into sexual violence. So they make a lot of propaganda out of this. ERA, which is a Cumann run propaganda sheet, actually publishes a lot about the conditions in the female jails. But it's not just, we must remember that there was genuine fear, I think. So while they make, propaganda out of it, they use it for propaganda purposes, it was very frightening to be a woman in these jails with the heavy overcrowding, with the fear of, being assaulted. Podine O'Keefe, who was the deputy governor in Kilmainham. He used to go, Kilmainham, Mountjoy?
I think it's
Mountjoy, yes. He used to go around and he used to say, "You'll be shot, she'll be shot." So he literally had a gun. And this was, I think it's very important, as historians, that we don't just think about what happened, but also how people experienced what happened. And there's one really interesting diary of female imprisonment. It's a partial diary of Dorothy Mcardle's time in Mountjoy, later Kilmainham. Dorothy Mcardle's brother burned all her papers when she died, an awful act of vandalism, but a part of this diary did survive, and it's in the Dáil Éireann papers, and it's a really interesting kind of insight into the day-to-day life in these prisons, the fear of the violence, also the way in which women were actually divided in the prisons as well. So you had the more militant women like Bridie O'Mullane, who believed in violence for the sake of violence, and then you had other women like Nora Connolly and Dorothy Mcardle, who felt that violence violence should be used for a real purpose. You know, there was no point in violence which would just lead to, you know, no letters allowed in or no parcels allowed in. That diary really gives an insight into the life in the prison, and it's very good also on the hunger strikes, because this is a weapon that women used during the Civil War in the jails. And when Dorothy Mcardle is arrested on the 8th of November, she goes to Mountjoy, and Mary MacSwiney is already in Mountjoy, having been arrested on the 4th of November, and the whole prison reverberates with Mary MacSweeney's hunger strike. The women are keeping a vigil by her bedside as she gets weaker and weaker. For a short period, some of the women go on sympathetic hunger strike, but she asks them to call it off. And of course, Mary MacSwiney on hunger strike in Mountjoy is a huge nightmare for the provisional government. So, you know, Terence McSweeney had been on hunger strike and died in Brixton, and the British had been indicted for allowing him to die in this way, for failing to release him. And now you have Mary MacSwiney, his sister, on hunger strike in Kilmainham, and Cosgrave refusing for some time to release her. And then it gets worse for the provisional government, because Annie MacSweeney, her sister, comes up from Cork. She's refused entry to see Mary MacSweeney. And the MacSweeney sisters make a lot of this because, of course, they had been allowed into Brixton Jail. The family had been allowed into Brixton Jail. But Annie has refused entry into Mountjoy, and she goes on hunger strike outside the walls of Mountjoy. There's a great description in the Irish Times where she's actually wearing a fur coat, and Maud Ghana's there, and they're wearing fur coats and they're in deckers. But this is a complete nightmare for the provisional government. I think it's wonderful if you think about it. Women are causing Cosgrave this kind of crisis. Does he allow Mary MacSweeney to die? There's telegraphs coming from America. He's been, you know, some people are actually saying to him, yeah, like, let this suffragette, one man writes to him, let this mad suffragette die. But there's a huge dilemma for him. In the event, she is released kind of quietly at the end of November, but she's rearrested in February, and she goes and rearrested again after Liam Lynch's funeral, or while travelling to Liam Lynch's funeral, and she goes on another hunger strike. So this is a weapon that women use.
Thanks for that. And of course, a weapon that was used so effectively by the suffrage movement, and which, you know, they continue to draw upon. And I think it's interesting there to, you know, think about the lasting trauma, of course, that these women experienced for the years afterwards. We could talk forever, but
just say one thing about the jail as well. In April 1923 in Kilmainham, and it shows the difference between the Republican women and the idealism of 1916, because there's Easter week in Kilmainham in 1923. You've got in jail Nora Connolly, you've got Grace Plunkett, the widow of James Plunkett, you've got Lily O'Brennan, the sister-in-law of A. McCann. All of these women, you've got the O'Rahilly's relatives, and Nora Connolly talks about being in the same jail, same cell that her father was at. And she said, I can't for a minute forget that this is where Papa was. And they have a whole ceremony remembering Easter week, and they have Pearce's play and things like that, and they all then recount something about the leaders. And Dorothy Mcardle, writing in Era, says it's like the voice of our dead leader speaking to us again. So all of these women are completely estranged from the state now.
And I think it's important to say that, you know, while, you know, that they had dead male relatives, they were activists themselves as well. So you know, it's not just they end up in jail because, you know, of their dead relatives. They're Mary MacSwiney, for example, you know, while Terence's death was a huge trauma, Mary MacSwiney had been active well before Terence's death in 1920. She was heavily involved in Cumann in Cork. She was a suffrage activist as well. So it's very important not to deny these women agency in their own right.
I think perhaps just to remember as well, actually they had a bit of fun too. In some of the diaries, they Cumann set up themselves. They organised themselves. So Margaret Skinner is director of training in Mountjoy and then the North Dublin Union, and they have games of rounders, and they keep themselves fit. And what they're doing really is keeping themselves in condition to continue the fight once they get out. They also have lectures and conversations, and Obviously, Margaret Skinner is a bit of a chitter-chatter person because she keeps giving out for staying talking late at night in the cells and keeping everybody awake. And so they have those interactions as well. And they are organising themselves. And they are organising themselves to be both keeping themselves active and fairly psychologically stable, but also in opposition, I think, to the structures around them, that they see themselves, they're in jail, but they're still coming on, and they're still going to be that organised organisation and do the things they want to do.
Yeah, the jail is a site of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think we might open it up to the audience at this stage. So we have a couple of roving microphones, the people in blue. So if you want to put your hands up, we have somebody over here, I think. So if you want to ask a question first.
Can I just ask, what was the attitude of the women in Dublin and rural Ireland who weren't involved in any of the organisations, like women who lived in the tenements, who were rearing their kids? Were they aware of these women in the prisons? Were they aware that these women were fighting a cause? Or were they at home and oblivious to all this that was going on? Like, what was their attitude to to what was going on?
Well, I think that eventually, because of the disruption, the Republican cause loses a lot of support because people just want some kind of normality in their lives. So I think that's one of the things that makes it very difficult for the Republican movement to continue, the anti-treaty movement, because they're not getting the support from the locals. I mean, Maura Comerford says by the end of the Civil War in the country, an IRA unit was 4 men in a dripping dugout, and you took a message and they might not be there when you came back, but they weren't getting support from people around. And the Battle of Dublin didn't last very long. It lasted 8 days, and it left, such chaos and rubble. Dublin was only starting to rebuild itself after 1916. So you can see that people in the tenements, I couldn't imagine, would necessarily have a lot of sympathy with them. But there was a women's delegation just at the time of the forecourts being bombarded. Women from Labour and feminism came together and on a sort of a women's peace delegation, it was called, and they went to Cosgrave and Collins, who just said, we're a government now and we have to keep order. And they went to Oscar Traynor in the Hammond Hotel, and he said, we've got this far, we have to keep going. But there were women who were trying to say, we need dialogue rather than fighting at this point.
Yeah. I think you have to remember as well that the country had been at war, or in violence had been there from almost a decade at this stage, if you consider First World War, the 1916 Rising, and then into the War of Independence. And people just wanted peace. They just wanted, as Margaret said, a return to normalcy, to be able to get on with their lives. And even in the countryside, you get a sense that while a lot of people, if an IRA soldier on the run turns up to what had been a sympathetic household in the War of Independence, they would get a bed for the night and get fed, but then go on your way. There was none of that real active support. That begins to fade away. And certainly in Kerry, after the terror months of March and April, and like the viciousness of the response of the National Army, people just don't want to bring that sort of violence down on top of them anymore, and they just want law and order and peace and go about their business. And so, they begin to fade away. And without the civilian population, then you're going nowhere, really.
Question here, thank you.
Thanks very much to all the women up there for the wonderful work you've done and for bringing much of it here to us today. I wanted to ask, during the War of Independence, we know that Labour intervened, and we know that there was actions in the north of Ireland. And I'm wondering, where's that in the Civil War? I'm assuming that there's a lot of problems because you're getting a lot of information now, aren't we, from the pensions sources. So what happens trying to find out, about the women in the north? Could they apply? Or people, men for that matter. And also, were the unions doing anything? Was there anything by way of strikes or any labour actions that were coming down on one side or the other in the Civil War, please?
Do you want to?
Well, I'll talk about the North, and then you could talk about Labour, yeah? In terms of the North, one of the things they say that when Collins dies, the war is over in the North, because Collins was the one that was promising arms. After that, a lot of the IRA, they either are neutral or they go over to the Free State side. And some of the Cumann women whose pension applications I've read just said that we just kept our heads down. Survival was the only thing we could think of, because you had a northern state with the Special Powers Act, etc. It was really very dangerous for any Republican activist at that time. So there had been Cumann for a very brief time after their convention in February. Ethnic Oil and people had reinstated the Belfast boycott, and they were taking newspapers off trains at gunpoint, etc. But that's, Ethnic Oil and people like that get arrested, and all of that stops. There was going to be a big Donegal, Petago IRA outpost. Sheila Humphreys talks about she's on her way there when the Four Courts is attacked, and all of that stops. So everything to do with the North basically stops at that time. But there are a lot of, if you go on to the pension applications, you'll see a lot of women's applications there. And it is the first time. I was very frustrated decades ago not being able to find out so much. But you do now, and in Belfast, it's mainly working class women round the Falls Road, for example, who suffer terrible hardships afterwards. A lot of them, if they did have a job, have lost it during the war. They're then known about, and they never get a job again. Out in country areas in Tyrone, for example, one woman was she and her husband were very substantial mill owners and large farmers, and she said that when partition happened, we were in hostile territories, how she puts it. Nobody would buy from us. Her husband ends up going to America penniless, and she said he died there a broken man, leaving me, with nothing. So there's a story of terrible poverty and disillusion and hardship in terms of the North.
Mary,
Well, of course, most of the Labour women had fought in 1916 with the Irish Citizen Army, but after that, most of them leave that and join Cumann, and they fight through the War of Independence and into the Civil War. So if you look at the activists who were Labour women, who were involved in trade union activism, who are anti-treaty, they continue fighting in the Civil War, but many of them, as Margaret said, they lose their jobs, they lose businesses. Again, looking at the working class Kerry women in Tralee, they talk about little businesses they'd set up or jobs they had. Like one, Hannah O'Connor leaves her job on August the 2nd, 1922 without permission, she said. And they never get those jobs back because, of course, they find themselves on the wrong side of history. And if you look at the pension files, what is extraordinary and horrible to read is how much poverty they are in when they are applying for the pension files, for the pension, and they're only getting the grade E pension, and they feel they deserve so much more. So they're not getting very much help from the state. Even with that little bit of help they're getting, it actually means that they're living in a little bit more comfort. Instead of extreme poverty, they're just in normal poverty once they get the pension. A lot of them then, once the Civil War is over, a lot of those women who had been involved in trade union activism go back into it, and they continue, and they work through the Irish Women's Workers' Union in Dublin, and they work in different organisations around the country. But they commit themselves, like Margaret Skinner, for example. She joins the INTO once she gets a job as a teacher after the Civil War, and ends up being its president in 1956, committing herself, as always, to the cause of labour and to the cause of women workers. And of course, the woman worker in the new Irish Free State was not in a very good position. The state saw women's places in the home. So the woman worker didn't get the supports, and she was paid way less than the male worker. Conditions of Employment Act meant that any Minister for Labour could say a woman can't work in this profession or that profession. They were not allowed to climb the ranks of the civil service. They couldn't take the civil service exams. The marriage bar comes in. So for the woman worker in the Free State, it is not a very happy position. And that doesn't change until decades in, I would say, until second wave feminism begins to campaign for the rights of the woman worker. So it isn't, and then for the Labour Party kind of sits the Civil War out in many ways. There are strikes during this period, the postal strike, railway strikes, but that's normal. The histories of labour, or normal labour history, it is individual members who are involved in the Civil War.
I think the position of single women who lost their jobs was particularly problematic, and the pension files really show really interesting examples of women who were dependent on male relatives, putting them in a really uncomfortable situation in certain cases. And you have actually male relatives writing to Aiken and even De Valera, saying, I'm tired of looking after this girl, and the girl might be 52. So that's something I've kind of been tracing at the moment, this kind of issue around single women and who lost their jobs, and the levels of dependency and the irritation of male relatives having to look after these women. And so many of these women, who had jobs, maybe in retail or whatever, lost their jobs, or else never did have a job because the presumption was you would possibly go on to get married, etc. But I think it's really important that we don't kind of have women as a homogenous group, that women are divided by class, they're divided by marital status, they're divided by, where they live in Ireland, etc.
Yeah. I think we could talk about women in the Free State and independent Ireland for quite some time, a whole other panel in itself. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but if you want to learn more about the research of these historians, there are books by all of them on sale outside, and the Military Service Pensions Collection is another wonderful primary source that is available free to make use of. For now, I think all we can say is thank you to our three speakers for their really excellent contributions.